Coming to you today from Seattle, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up this hour, the midterm elections are over, but the security risks remain. We talk about the cyber threats that still hang over coming elections worldwide, and why, despite the meddling outcry, Facebook and Google are the big winners of the night. Plus, LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman speaks out on Facebook's handling of the elections and shares his prescription for regulation going forward. And The Boring Company comes to San Francisco. Maybe. How a Twitter exchange between Mark Benioff and Elon Musk just might bring the transportation fix the Bay Area needs, if it's not all just a billionaire's dream. But first, to our top story, and that is Facebook and its handling of the U.S. midterm elections. Facebook got a tip from U.S. authorities about accounts that may be tied to Russia's Internet Research Agency. This is the same agency accused in a federal indictment in February of trying to interfere in the 2016 election. Facebook said it removed those accounts along with content that falsely claimed Democrats and Republicans were supposed to vote on different days. Now that the midterm elections are over, we do want to take stock of the threat as it stands. Joining us now, Bloomberg Tech's Sarah Friar, who, of course, covers Facebook, as well as Lawrence Norden of the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. Lawrence, I want to start with you. Assess, the integrity of the elections, over the last 24 hours. How did we do?
Well, there are two things that we should be talking about, I suppose. One is, and because we saw this in 2016, there are at least two avenues where we've seen interference in our elections. One is with the election infrastructure. And I would say when it comes to the mechanics of the elections, things for most people looked pretty good yesterday. There's some notable glitches, but by and large, it looked like a normal election. And I didn't see anything yesterday in terms of that infrastructure, the voting machines, the reporting on election night, that it looked like there was any kind of interference.
Well, there were reports of voting machines, electronic voting machines, breaking down across the country, and as a result, long lines. We can expect some people probably just went home or went to their jobs because they couldn't stand in those long lines. What's the extent of that, and why did it happen?
Yeah. Sadly, I think that happened more than it should happen, and where we did see it, in most cases, I think we can tie it to how old our equipment is. We've got in the states that really saw problems, Georgia as an example, South Carolina, Philadelphia, we heard of examples of machines sometimes flipping votes. We heard that in early voting. We heard on election day where it wasn't registering the vote that the voter intended, and machines breaking down, and those kinds of things lead to long lines. And I think that really comes down to a lack of investment in all of those cases in Texas as well. You've got some really old machines, and they just need to be replaced. I will say I haven't seen any evidence that was the result of foul play, but the flip side of reliability is security, and if we continue to use those systems, we do leave ourselves vulnerable in 2020, particularly if these machines that don't have paper backups. As Undersecretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Chris Krebs, said, 2020 is the big game, and I think we need to be prepared for that.
So let's talk about potential foul play. Sarah, we got notified by Facebook that they had taken down these accounts in the middle of Election Day. What exactly happened?
So on Sunday night, Facebook gets a warning from federal authorities that it may have some accounts on Facebook and Instagram that were linked to the IRA, which, as you said, was related to the 2016 election interference. And Facebook has been trying to invest in finding these things. Their latest tip comes from the federal government. They take them down, and then the IRA puts out a post, or someone claiming to be them at least, puts out a post listing the accounts, sort of taking credit for what they've done. And Facebook removed a few more. And then a little bit after polls close, they come out and say, linking these accounts more directly to the IRA. They're still not definitively saying if this is coming from Russia. We have found other election interference type campaigns using fake accounts on Facebook in the last few months that are from Iran, that are from domestic actors. So far they think this is Russia, but we're not sure yet.
And Lawrence, both Sarah and I have been inside Facebook's election war room, where they've got a team of people, working across all of these potential threats. And the familiar refrain from in there is that actually the biggest threats, the most activity they saw was from within the United States, not from outside the United States. Despite this revelation of accounts potentially connected to the IRA. How dangerous is that? How much of a threat is that? Well,
first of all, I should say that there's additional information about the IRA. There was the U.S. attorney fingered a conspiracy at the beginning of just about a month ago, saying that there was a conspiracy to with about a $10 million a year budget to post on social media to buy ads that were meant to interfere in our election. So that's ongoing. And I would say the concern there is what it might signal for the future. And that is, while it wasn't nearly what it was in 2018 compared to what we saw in 2016, my concern would be that they're going to come back in a big way ahead of 2020 when the stakes are much bigger. And again, this other area of election infrastructure, while we didn't see a lot of activity in this election, that we have to be worried, again, that they're going to come back in a bigger way in 2020. And I think we have to take the necessary steps to protect from that.
Sarah, you have a new piece out today that talks about how even before the election happened, Facebook and Google were the ad winners. How big?
So political ad spending is up across the board, and I think that ties a little bit to what we've seen in terms of voter turnout and just the excitement and energy around from both sides trying to figure out how this election is going to affect us, given sort of the divisive political climate right now. So political spending is up. It has nothing to do with there's been no sort of fallback in spending related to some of the problems we've seen. One thing I would point out, though, is the transparency efforts from the companies to try to make that spending a little more accountable to their users, to make it clear who's paying for what ads. There have been reports coming out in the last few weeks saying that is very easy to falsify on Facebook, that they need to secure that system. There were reporters who went out and bought ads in the name of Mitch McConnell, in the name of ISIS, in the name of Mike Pence. It is very easy to say the ad is paid for by someone who it's not paid for by.
That is just so fascinating. Now, Larry, there's a chance of runoffs in Georgia in particular. This is a place where there were reports of voter flipping, the long lines, the failed machines. What could they learn or fix, in time for an election in a matter of weeks?
Well, look, a really big thing, and we saw a problem with this yesterday in Georgia, is they need to have backups if machines go down. So we had reports in Georgia of lines for hours when machines went down, of running out of paper ballots. They should have emergency paper ballots there, 2 to 3 hours worth, so that if something goes down and it takes some time to fix or replace the equipment, people can continue to vote. And they obviously didn't have that in places where people were on lines, but in some cases they were saying 4.5 hours.
Now, Sarah, what is the status of the Facebook election war room at this point? Does that war room remain open? What are the upcoming elections around the world that they might be monitoring?
Well, they're monitoring all sorts of elections. One thing I've heard from sources within Facebook is that people are incredibly focused on the 2020 election. Just like you're saying, that's really the future here. That's what this is been preparing for. The war room, in effect, is testing all of the systems to see if they're willing to, update them and fix them, and maybe even introduce new secure measures ahead of 2020 to make sure that these systems get stronger. So I think that really is the ultimate goal. But in between now and then, there are plenty of elections around the world where Facebook's war room will be operating. They haven't said anything about sort of the long-term usage of that room. This is kind of a test, but hopefully we'll hear more from them on that, and also more from them on these Russian accounts. Hopefully we'll get to see what these accounts are posting and how long they were active for and what effect they may have had.
And, security experts have said the U.S. midterm elections may not be as vulnerable as a big presidential election, because for foreign actors, it's really confusing. There are so many different races. It's difficult to know whether certain local issues are good for that actor or not. So it really is, Larry, about 2020. There's been bipartisan election security legislation that hasn't quite made it through Congress. With a Democratic House now, does that legislation stand a chance?
Look, I think the Democrats have said in the House that this is going to be a priority for them. So I think they are going to push this harder than it was pushed probably in the last couple of years. So I do think that there's a chance. There was a lot of bipartisan support in the Senate. For whatever reason, it didn't get out of committee. But I would expect that there's going to be a lot more focus on this in Congress, and that may end up pushing things through. And I should say that's on the infrastructure side. On the social media side, of course, everything that Facebook and Google are doing right now in this space is voluntary, unlike TV and radio and print. By accident, they are not subject to the same kinds of laws and regulations. And so we may see a push there as well for them to actually have to follow some federal regulations on this.
All right. Well, we'll, of course, be covering potential runoffs and then all eyes on 2020. Larry Norden of the Brennan Center, thanks so much, as well as Bloomberg Tech's Sarah Fryer. Coming up, SoftBank making moves for a potential IPO of its mobile phone unit. Why the company wants to raise $18 billion from Japanese investors next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology, coming to you today from Seattle. I'm Emily Chang. SoftBank wants to raise a record $18 billion from investors for the IPO of its mobile phone unit. Bloomberg has learned the company is targeting people who often get no interest on their savings. Nomura Holdings will sell the biggest part of the shares to retail investors. For more, I want to bring in Bloomberg Tech's Selena Wang. Selena, what does this all mean?
So we already knew that they were trying to raise about 3 trillion yen from this IPO, but now we're learning that they want to allocate about 2 trillion of this to individual retail investors. Now, for some context, the amount that's allocated to individuals varies country by country, offering by offering, but the size of the amount that they want to allocate shows that they're expecting very strong demand from the individual investors in Japan. Now, when we spoke to analysts told Bloomberg that given the strong brand presence of SoftBank and the fact that Masa-san has said that they plan to give high dividends to their investors, that there will be strong demand from individuals.
So, what do we know about how big this IPO will really be?
So 3 trillion yen, and in terms of the size that they're selling to retailers, if the 2 trillion yen actually comes to fruition, that would be a record sale of shares to the retail investor, and so it's a pretty big deal. Now, stepping back a little bit, the spinoff of this mobile unit from the SoftBank core group is a big deal for Masa-san, because he is really trying to shift his attention to this tech conglomerate that has been investing in startups from Uber to WeWork, and now he's able to really focus more of his time on that tech investing conglomerate. And when we spoke to him the other month, he already said that he's dedicating about 97% of his time to investing and only 3% of it to the mobile telecoms unit, and this will make that official.
So then, is this particular unit fairly protected from the controversy surrounding SoftBank's ties to Saudi money?
It's a great question. It has been decently protected. That part of the unit doesn't rely on Saudi Arabia in the same way that the Vision Fund does. And earlier this week, when they reported earnings, Masa-san, during a briefing, did mention that he did meet with the Crown Prince. He spoke about how horrible the issue was and pressed him for more information, but that the quote he said was basically, it's a terrible tragedy that shouldn't have occurred. But on the other hand, we have accepted an investment from the citizens of Saudi Arabia Arabia. It's an important investment for the economic diversification of Saudi Arabia to get their economy away from depending solely on crude oil. We cannot turn our backs on the Saudi people. Now, another interesting piece of news shifting back to the mobile unit is that Masa Son has said he plans on cutting a significant percentage of the workforce to increase profits, and they plan to get there largely through automation.
Now, this is just another step in the sort of overall remaking of SoftBank. Ultimately, once this happens, if it happens, what does SoftBank look like? What remains?
Now, what will be there will be this tech conglomerate, this vision fund that we've seen really fueling the ambitions of Masa Son. He wants to be driving the future of artificial intelligence, and he thinks that by investing in these companies that he can propel them to the dominant positions in every industry, because he believes that artificial intelligence is going to drastically change companies around the globe. Now, this really means that Masa Son can focus on these grand ambitions. He's not going to be thinking about the day-to-day operations of this mobile telecoms unit that he has been mired in for most of his career, and now he can really double down on investing here. And we have yet to see if the controversy with Saudi Arabia is going to have any impact on the fund. It seems that, as we've reported before, that it's going to be very difficult for him to find tens of billions of dollars from any other single entity beyond Saudi Arabia.
All right, Bloomberg Tech, Selena Wang will continue to follow. Thanks so much. Coming up, policing tech. LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman's prescription for regulation. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Reid Hoffman has an eye for tech success stories. Not only did he found LinkedIn, but he also invested in Facebook and Airbnb early. Today, several tech giants, however, that he helped get off the ground are at the forefront of data privacy, security, and transparency issues. Bloomberg's David Weston sat down with Hoffman on the latest episodes of Big Decisions. Take a listen to what Hoffman had to say.
I think the thing that the tech industry has been learning has been, oh, well, we're not just the challengers, we're not just the disruptors, we're now becoming part of the infrastructure, the social infrastructure, the logistics infrastructure. And as we become part of that infrastructure and we get to the scale of it, our responsibilities change. We can't just say, hey, trust us, we're going to build new products. We have to be transparent, we have to be disclosive, we have to be in dialogue with society, and we have to be more careful about which risks we take, because we have a greater impact with that.
Does technology have a brand problem? We love Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media we're on. At the same time, there are some real questions being raised now. Can we trust these people with our information, with our data, with our patterns or not? Is there a branding problem here?
I think there's definitely a brand challenge at the moment, but I think it's more a little bit like kind of teenage years as we grow. I think it's recoverable. Like if you ask a lot of people, do they love their iPhone? Do they love their technology service? The answer is generally yes. But they now need to, we as the tech industry now need to say, but people also want to feel safe. And they don't feel safe if it's a lot of things about like cyber hacking or my information was hacked. And so we now need to have a higher level of standard of safety there. And that needs to be added into the way we communicate with people.
So you spend a lot of time with the leaders of tech out in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. Do they get it?
I think they're learning. So if you said, do they have it 100% right now? Not yet. But I think they're on a learning curve that's moving pretty fast. So I think they will absolutely get there.
And what is the role potentially of government regulation? Let's talk about U.S. government regulation. Is there going to be regulation? Should there be regulation?
It's very possible that some regulation could be good. it's a lot easier to do a lot of damage to the tech industry, to our position of the tech industry in the world, to the invention of the future, to this lead in this industry that we have, than it is to do help. So I think we should be very careful. So I think where the dialogue should be right now is not as much should we regulate, should we not regulate, as much as what should the target be? Like, for example, what do we want out of the social infrastructure of the social media companies? What do we want on the handling of data? What do we want on the new evolution of these technological platforms, AI and so forth? And what are some of the kind of guidelines that we say, look, we want you guys as companies telling us about these issues, reporting on them, and we want you to be more transparent about them so that we can see how we need to push you, and whether or not the push is a dialogue, whether the push is an inquiry, or whether the push is a regulation. And I think that's where the conversation needs to be.
So if there were constructive regulation, would it be on the subject of meaningful disclosure? Not just disclosure, but meaningful disclosure.
So I think the question would be to figure out, well, what kind of transparency do we think would be most helpful and most meaningful to us? Like, I do think the very first thing would be is, tell us about this stuff, and if you're not being disclosive enough, then we'll make regulation to make you disclose. And then the question is, well, is it, for example, data security? Is it an ability to have controls over about your understanding how your data is being used and your buy-in to that? Those probably are the zone, but how do you do that in the right kind of simple way that also leads to a lot of ability to innovate in the future?
So as you talk with the Sheryl Sandbergs of this world, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, what is the discussion about how do you get in front of this instead of the appearance that you're getting dragged kicking and screaming?
I think the key thing is to show that you're to be transparent and disclosive about that you're investing in the things that people care about. And by the way, they are. They're investing in, like, for example, election integrity. They're investing in data security. And not just to do it, but to show people you're doing it. To show people, you say, I hear what your worries are, and we're working on them. And by the way, it may take us a few iterations to learn it exactly, but we care about it, and we're investing in it. And then to be talking about that. And I think they're beginning, like, I think they're on path to exactly those conversations.
Reid Hoffman there, co-founder of LinkedIn. Coming up, what the midterms mean for the future of tech policy and a newly Democratic House. We're also going to talk about Amazon, new headquarters on the East Coast, how Amazon is trying to reinvent itself on the other side of the country, and what it means for the price of surrounding areas. That's next. This is Bloomberg. And this is Bloomberg Technology coming to you today from the Bloomberg Bureau in Seattle. We're talking now about the midterms, the U.S. midterm elections, one for the record books, the Democratic Party taking control of the U.S. House. While it wasn't a landslide, it is a victory that could mean changes in policy for big tech. House Democrats are likely to push for a robust data privacy law and could look to reinstate Obama-era net neutrality rules when they take control of the chamber next year. Joining me now, I want to bring in Bloomberg's Ryan Vlastelica in New York. Also with us in Washington, we have Ben Brody, who covers lobbying. Ben, I want to start with a high level here. Look, maybe it wasn't quite a blue wave, but the Democrats taking control of the House is huge. What could that mean for some of the big tech policy issues on the agenda?
Well, I think the way you started out is exactly right. I'm looking to privacy primarily. Net neutrality has obviously been a hot ticket item in the past, but privacy is where Republicans have signaled that they're willing to make a deal. Now, of course, they are still holding the Senate. They've actually extended their lead in the Senate, and Donald Trump is still a Republican last time I checked. Now, interestingly, this morning he said that he might be willing to work with Democrats to regulate tech companies. That could mean something like antitrust scrutiny, but to me, I heard privacy, so that's really what I'm seeing. And the question that I'm watching is how are the parties going to fight it out? And essentially that means how are the different chambers going to fight it out on how privacy enforcement is essentially done. So that's, I think, really what I'm watching. Then maybe we could turn to broadband infrastructure, net neutrality, antitrust, some of these other issues.
I want to take a closer look at what he had to say about social media companies. Long, heated press conference with the president earlier today. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Believe it or not, I'm one that really likes free speech. A lot of people don't understand that, but I am a big believer. When you start regulating, a lot of bad things can happen. But I would certainly talk to the Democrats if they want to do that, and I think they do want to do that.
Now, the president, some of his associates, like his 2020 campaign manager, have come down hard on Facebook and Twitter and Google for bias. The president has also singled out Amazon. Ryan, read between the lines there. What is the president saying about tech regulation?
Well, I think when it comes to tech, the area of social media is really the one that's going to be most in focus. It is a rare point of bipartisan agreement when it comes to the idea of regulating any kind of industry. And Republicans and Democrats are probably going to come at this from different issues. You have issues pertaining to harassment, election interference, and misinformation. You have data privacy, like we were talking about before. You'll probably be able to find some sort of consensus on these. Who knows what it's going to look like? Who knows how easy it'll be to institute it from a technical perspective? A lot of these companies, especially Facebook, have been already trying to grapple with some of these issues. How do they get some of the content off their platforms? How do they protect data? So on and so forth. So it remains to be seen when any of this will actually take effect, what the regulation is going to look like, what they're going to be required to do that they're not already trying to do right now. But as far as it goes, this is really one area where you have both Democrats and Republicans probably willing to work together.
Now, Ben, as you've reported, some of these tech companies are very active when it comes to lobbying. Millions and millions of dollars invested. What have Facebook and Google, what kind of money and causes have they been pushing for?
Right, absolutely. As you say, they're spending millions, and that's something that they've really ramped up in the last year. Just a few years ago, they were doing less than a quarter in some cases of what they're doing now. I think one of the things they're watching very, very closely is antitrust scrutiny. It's important to say here that we don't know of any antitrust case that's out there, but it's something that really scares them. Very often it's something that they want to hold off, throttle it in the cradle, if you will. It's not one of those things that they're willing to just kind of monitor from afar and let it develop. So I've seen a lot of development on antitrust scrutiny. I've seen a lot on net neutrality. I expect to see a lot on privacy. A lot of the trade groups that I work with have come out with privacy principles, been very active taking meetings on the Hill, and I think will be a big, big part of that discussion going forward, not least of all because they're looking at Europe and they're looking at California and they're seeing that the policy landscape is sort of already set here. And so the question is, can they make inroads here in Washington to get something that's a little more congenial?
Right. Of course, Europe has taken a much harder line on tech companies. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars in fines. We never quite know what President Trump means when he talks about regulation. Amazon is another company, Ryan, that he has honed in on, and especially because Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, which President Trump clearly hates. We now have Amazon moving potentially its second headquarters into Northern Virginia in close proximity to the White House. How might that play out?
Well, I don't think there's as much of a regulatory risk to Amazon as there is to, again, some of these social media names. President Trump has talked about maybe changing postal rates or something like that as some sort of punishment, or he discusses sales tax with online retail, things that haven't really been accurate, frankly, and also there doesn't seem to be a ton of appetite within the legislature to make big changes on this. Amazon remains a very popular company with consumers. Probably the worst case scenario for it would be some kind of breakup plan, but I really can't imagine that will gain much traction in either House of Congress.
Ben, President Trump and his campaign manager, Brad Parscale, are tweeting about Facebook and Twitter and bias all the time. How do you imagine those issues might play out leading into 2020, given that, these are the very same companies that could have helped him win the election by their own admission?
Absolutely. And it was so fascinating in that clip that you put up, Emily, that he said that he loves free speech and he is worried about regulating it. That's, of course, a challenge that he would face if he really is going to keep the pressure on some of those bias issues. But, of course, here in Washington, just because you talk about something doesn't mean you actually need to get it done. And if he or Brad Parscale, his campaign manager, decide that it's useful to talk about bias online, if that is firing people up, they have no qualms about doing it, turning people out and getting them to the polls. One of the really amazing things that he did yesterday was to keep some of those low propensity voters who came out seemingly just once for him in 2016 to come out again for him yesterday. If he thinks talking about tech bias is going to do it again, he will not hesitate for a second.
Ryan, several tech stocks rallied after the polls closed. What's behind that?
Well, these are stocks that have been taking a pretty big beating for the past month or so. Facebook is down about a third since its most recent record. Amazon, Google, they all warned on some growth issues last month in their most recent quarterly statements. So they've been under pressure, and just because they're such major market bellwethers, if the market's going to rise, they're probably going to participate with it, if not lead it. But you are seeing a little bit more weakness in some of the social media names. Part of that is you have Match Group, which last night gave a disappointing outlook, which is weighing on some of the social media stocks. It's not the same issues that are impacting Facebook and Twitter, but that's out there too.
All right, Bloomberg's Ryan Vlastelica and our very own Ben Brody, thank you both. Of course, we're going to continue to follow all of these issues coming up. We're going to talk a little bit more about Amazon's big move to the East Coast and potentially 2 new cities. Also, could Elon Musk's boring company tunnels be coming to San Francisco? Next. That's coming up. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology from Seattle. I'm Emily Chang. Amazon is nearing the end of its year-long quest to find a second headquarters. And with the company now expected to split HQ2 between 2 locations, all eyes are on Long Island City and the Crystal Springs area of Arlington, Virginia. While no official announcements have been made, the cities are gearing up for the impact of Amazon's arrival, with hopes of reinventing their communities. Amazon's potential Long Island City arrival ramps up enthusiasm for real estate investors who could get generous tax breaks because of the city's opportunity zone classifications. Meantime, Crystal Springs is intent on filling empty office spaces once filled by government tenants. Here to discuss, we've got Redfin CEO Glenn Kelman. So, Glenn, you not only run a real estate tech company, but you're based in Seattle, and you've seen the impact of Amazon's headquarters in Seattle, for better and for worse. What's your reaction to these 2 cities on the East Coast? Not 1 city, but 2, and both on the East Coast.
Well, I think there's not a single city that's big enough for Amazon's ambitions. It realized just how many people it wanted to employ over the next decade, and the Everything Store decided that it couldn't put its eggs in even 2 baskets. It had to have 3. So the real estate market is going to change in Seattle as a result, and I think it's also going to change in Virginia and New York.
So Virginia and New York, and we're talking about 2 pretty established metropolitan areas here, but let's get hyper-local. What does this mean for Long Island City and the surrounding areas when it comes to housing?
Well, obviously, you're going to see more pressure on housing. I think the government has to agree to create more inventory. That was certainly a slow-coming process here in Seattle. We finally have more density than ever, but Seattle really limited Amazon's growth because it was just so hard to house all the people that Amazon wanted to hire. So I think you're going to see a building frenzy in both New York and Virginia, and obviously in both of those places, there's room to grow. They chose large cities, but they went to the edge of those cities so that there was some room for people to commute to work, for people to find housing. So Amazon made some good choices here if they're worried about really being able to grow into 2 fairly sizable cities already.
What would you say to the residents of these areas, though? Because, of course, city, state governments, they're excited. They're excited about the economic boost this will bring, but people who live in these areas may not be so excited.
Well, it's a mixed blessing, but it's still a blessing when a company comes to town that is going to create really high-paying jobs. Everyone should be excited about that. You just have to plan for the growth. So if you put your head in the stand, which has sometimes happened in San Francisco or Seattle, you are going to have a spike in housing prices. You are going to have traffic and congestion and all the rest. But if you go into it and say, we are going to use some of this money to create the infrastructure for a real middle class, to create better transit, to create dense housing, you could have a much better situation than we've ever seen before. So I think you just have to plan for the growth. But everybody should want the money.
Now, we've talked about a potential real estate slowdown across the country, and the question has been, well, how long will this be? Will this be a sustained slowdown? Now that we are through the midterm elections, what do you see?
Well, we certainly see a slowing real estate market in the fourth quarter. People, especially in the West Coast, are stepping back from making offers on homes. It's one of the crazy things about real estate that when you have a sale, everybody runs out of the store. So buyers are trying to figure out if prices are going to drop further, if rates are going to go up more. They're trying to figure out how to pay for houses, especially in the California markets and Seattle. So that is going to be a real challenge for the overall economy next year. But the question is whether real estate's going to drag the whole economy down or if the rest of the economy is going to stay strong and bring real estate back up. Because there's a good chance that going into 2019, you've got a roaring economy, you've got a good stock market, and we're going to look back at this fourth quarter and say, oh, I could have had a V8. There were houses that were actually affordable. There weren't such crazy bidding wars. There was a lull in the market. But it's also possible that this could be the beginning of a longer downturn, and everyone's trying to figure that out. And if I had the answer, I wouldn't be on this TV show. I would be buying or selling houses in earnest. But it's still anybody's guess.
What does it mean, Glenn, for the tech economy and tech hubs like Seattle, like San Francisco, where the real estate market has been booming? I mean, do those markets stay up, go flat, or do you actually see a pronounced dip?
Well, those are the markets that actually are most volatile. I think some of it's influenced by the stock market. There's been a correction in the stock market. We've given up some of the gains that we saw earlier in the year. And people in San Francisco and Seattle are using their stock to pay for a house. You certainly can't do it just with your salary. And so the fact that those markets are starting to cool is actually probably good news for tech employers. Many of us have worried that we have to open an office in Virginia or Montana or who knows where just to be able to pay the rent so that our employees could have a good life, start a family, and still work for us for a reasonable wage. So I think the fact that some of these coastal cities are cooling in the real estate prices is actually good news for all the businesses that are based in those coastal cities. It's a long-needed correction.
Got to ask you about Proposition C, the very controversial ballot measure in San Francisco where they're instituting a new business tax, and the revenue would go towards fighting homelessness. You've got people like Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff, who were all for this, and other tech leaders like Jack Dorsey, who runs both Twitter and Square, who were against it. His argument was they need better, more structured legislations, and that this would tax Square, for example, unfairly. It passed, pretty successfully. What's your take?
Well, I think you get these dingbat laws when the government can't work with city leaders to do something more reasonable. People go to the ballot box and they see an initiative that's finally going to do something about homelessness. And even though it's not what anyone would prefer, it's better than nothing. And it shows the difference that Mark Benioff can make, because there was another tax like that up here in Seattle and it didn't pass because no one had the charisma and the force that Mark Benioff does. That guy is a freak. And the fact that he got behind this made such a difference. And so, to me, we are going to be having this conversation over and over again. It's not just in San Francisco. It's in Denver, in Austin, in Seattle, in Pittsburgh. Tech wealth has come to the rest of the country, and we don't know what to do with it. So I think we're going to have to take some of those gains and invest that in social services for other people. And when we do that, we're all going to feel better about living in San Francisco and making money in Seattle and building great businesses that affect the rest of the world.
Mark Benioff did come on our show to promote Prop C, but let me be clear. Do you think it's a dingbat law?
Well, first of all, I feel a little weird taking a position on it. I'm not trying to be evasive, but I don't have to pay the tax. Our company is too small in San Francisco to pay it, so it's sort of a lame thing for us to say, well, everybody else ought to pay it. But what I have noticed is that when voters get really frustrated that the government isn't doing anything, they do a tax that probably isn't the ideal tax. And it could have been better structured. It could have been funneled to different programs. There's lots of ways that we could have attacked this problem by creating more inventory and other things. But when the government can't figure anything out, the voters are going to take measures into their own hands, and that's what happened.
Now, Benioff makes the argument that he knows a lot of billionaires who don't give away enough of their money, or none at all, and it has certainly frustrated him privately, and perhaps some of his frustration there was taken out in the promotion of Prop C. But do you think that he has a good argument that tech billionaires and the winners in this tech economy could be doing a lot more? I mean, Amazon and Jeff Bezos, could that be another good example? If Amazon had been perhaps more involved or given back a bit more, then maybe they could have worked it out with the city of Seattle.
Well, first of all, I don't know a lot of billionaires. So who am I to judge how much they're giving? I haven't looked at their balance sheet, but I don't think that philanthropy is the solution. There's a way that our society gets together and decides who's going to pay for this stuff and how are we going to use the money. And that is through taxes and social programs and democracy. So this argument that Jeff Bezos ought to give more money or less money, that Bill Gates ought to give more money or less money, to me seems beside the point. We should get together as a society and decide how are we going to pay for this stuff. And everybody's going to have to pay for it a little bit. And the folks who have a lot more money will probably have to pay a bit more too. That seems fair to me. But just the argument that, oh, I didn't see you at last week's charity auction, and you were only raising the paddle for $5,000 and not $10,000, that is a drop in the bucket. That is not the way democracies solve problems. And I don't think they should do it with initiatives either. I think we should take the people who are elected to do this job and let them do their job. And when they come up with something that's sort of annoying and kind of hurts us a little bit, and we could have been a little bit different about it, just get behind it. Because, when you shoot down an okay bill or a good bill, what you get next is a crazy one.
All right. Redfin CEO Glenn Kelman not keeping us guessing about what you think. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Thanks,
Always
Emily.
great to chat with you when we are in Seattle. Thanks so much. Coming up, we're going to be talking about Mark Benioff a little bit more and Elon Musk's Boring Company, how the two billionaires could be working together on their next project. Coming up, this is Bloomberg. I'm Emily Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology. We're talking about Mark Benioff now and Elon Musk. Before San Francisco's controversial homeless tax Prop C had even passed Tuesday, the number one backer, Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff, had already moved on to the next city issue. After Elon Musk tweeted out a first look at the Boring Company's first tunnel under the streets of LA, Benioff called on the Tesla CEO to bring the technology to San Francisco. Tweeting, quote, Elon, can you and Boring Company help us in San Francisco? We have a cool new transit center soon, but we need rapid transportation from downtown to Ocean, Marin Country, East Bay, San Jose, LA bullet train, too far away. Can you do it? Musk responded in a tweet saying, sure, we can do it. The Boring Company's LA tunnel is a test for a future system in which passengers travel by pod underneath the city in hopes of reducing traffic. Our Bloomberg Business Week columnist Max Trafkin knows about all of this, but first of all, how real is this conversation between Musk and Benioff, Max?
Not that real. The demonstration tunnel is, pretty short. I think it's just a couple miles long. These things require massive investment, permitting, lots of stuff that would have to be decided. The one thing I will say is that Elon Musk has made big sort of investments by Twitter before. We saw a big solar project sort of get agreed to in a similar Twitter exchange. So we can't totally discount this, but I would more see this as a sign of two moguls feeling pretty confident. Benioff because, he just had this big win at Prop C, and Musk because things seem to be kind of moving on the right track at Tesla.
Now, remind us, and you know a lot about what the Boring Company is working on, but we're talking about a pod vehicle that can really only seat 16 people, which is a tiny fraction of what a subway can carry. So how big an impact would a transportation system like this, if it was possible, if it was to come to San Francisco, actually have?
I think if it were exactly as you described it, probably not huge, obviously, because it'd be pretty small. I mean, what Musk has said, and you know, when I talked to him about this a couple years ago, when the Boring Company was just getting off the ground, is that he's envisioning, you know, massive systems. So this would be, you know, these pods would probably be part of a much larger system that would include, you know, hyperloop trains and lots of pods and a sled thing to put your cars on. So I don't think he has any delusions about, you know, about scale. I think the idea would be if this became a real thing, which is a huge if, then, you know, there would be much bigger pods and lots more of them.
How much time do you imagine, Max, that Musk is spending on the Boring Company versus Tesla versus SpaceX?
If you are a Tesla investor, you would hope it's very low, and I think he's come out publicly and said, you know, I forget, it's a, you know, single-digit percentage points. I mean, he's a guy who's, you know, known for multitasking. He's running, you know, Tesla and SpaceX and has, you know, has been pretty successful as a sort of part-time CEO. So who knows? That said, I'm sure that you know, Tesla investors, you know, if this were to become, you know, a lot more real, might start to get kind of anxious.
Bloomberg Businessweek's Max Chafkin with some very unboring commentary today. Max, as always, thanks so much. Good to have you. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology from Seattle. Tomorrow, I will be back in San Francisco. We're going to be hearing from the Gojek CEO from the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg.